Grace Williams pressed her face against the airplane window as Seoul's glittering skyline emerged through the clouds, her heart splitting in two like it had every day for the past month. Behind her in Atlanta, her 7-year-old son Marcus was probably finishing his cereal while her 9-year-old daughter Keisha braided her own hair for school. The image burned behind her eyes as she gripped the armrest, knowing she would miss another bedtime story, another scraped knee that needed kissing, another homework assignment that needed checking. The sacrifice felt like drowning in reverse, each breath harder than the last as the plane descended toward a life she never wanted but desperately needed. 3 jobs in Atlanta had not been enough to keep the lights on after her ex-husband disappeared with their savings, leaving her with medical bills from Keisha's asthma treatments that towered like mountains she could never climb. When the domestic agency offered her a position with a wealthy Korean family in Seoul for 3 times what she made cleaning offices at night, Grace knew she had no choice even though it meant leaving her babies with her mother for at least 2 years. She wondered if any of you watching this have ever had to leave everything you love behind for a chance to save your family. And if you have, I hope you'll share where you're watching from, because sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles makes the impossible feel a little less heavy. The Incheon airport overwhelmed her senses with announcements in Korean that sounded like music she could not understand, but the driver holding a sign with her name spoke enough English to guide her to a black sedan that probably cost more than her mother's house. During the hour-long drive through Seoul's maze of towering buildings and neon signs, Grace clutched her phone with photos of Marcus and Keisha, whispering a prayer that this job would be the answer to every desperate prayer she had sent up during those sleepless nights when the eviction notices piled up on her kitchen table. The mansion that emerged behind iron gates looked like something from a movie, all glass and stone rising 4 stories into the sky with gardens that probably required their own staff to maintain. Grace's reflection in the car window showed a woman trying to look confident while terror and hope battled in her chest, knowing that for the next 2 years this place would be her world and these strangers would determine whether her children back home would have a future worth fighting for. Kong Woo-jin answered the door himself, a man in his early 40s with kind eyes that seemed older than his face, wearing an expensive suit that somehow made him look more tired than powerful. He welcomed her in English tinged with a slight accent, explaining that his late wife had insisted their household staff be treated with respect and that he hoped Grace would find comfort in his home. Behind him, 2 children peered around the corner with faces that held the same exhausted sadness their father carried, and Grace felt her maternal instincts immediately respond to their quiet vulnerability. The woman who glided down the marble staircase 30 minutes later moved like a predator wrapped in designer silk, her smile sharp enough to cut glass as she introduced herself as Isabella Chun, Woo-jin's fiancée. Everything about her screamed money and control, from her perfectly styled hair to her manicured nails that she drummed against her purse while studying Grace like an insect she might need to squash. When Isabella spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that came from never being told no, and Grace felt the first whisper of unease crawl up her spine as she realized this woman saw her as something less than human. The children appeared again during dinner, 8-year-old Daniel moving like a shadow, while 6-year-old Sophia clung to her brother's hand with fingers that seemed too small to carry whatever burden made her eyes so serious. Isabella's voice turned sweet as honey when Woo-jin looked her way, praising the children's table manners and asking about their school day with theatrical concern. But Grace caught the warning looks Isabella shot toward Daniel when he reached for his water with the wrong hand, and the way Sophia flinched when Isabella's fingers briefly touched her shoulder in what anyone else would see as affection. That first night in the small but comfortable room near the kitchen, Grace video called her babies while they ate breakfast 7,000 miles away. Marcus had lost another tooth and wanted to show her the gap in his smile, while Keisha had painted a picture of a house with 4 windows that she said was for when mommy comes home and we can all live together again. Grace smiled and laughed and promised them treats from Korea while her heart broke into smaller pieces with each word, knowing that every day she stayed here was another day stolen from the childhood she was supposed to be sharing with them. As she ended the call and prepared for bed in a house that smelled like expensive furniture polish and secrets, Grace whispered another prayer into the soul darkness. She prayed for strength to survive the loneliness, for wisdom to navigate whatever complex dynamics she had glimpsed during dinner, and for the fierce determination that had carried her through every impossible situation life had thrown at her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges in this world of wealth and hidden tensions. But tonight she held tight to the image of Marcus and Keisha's faces and the promise that this sacrifice would give them the future they deserved. The last thing she heard before sleep took her was the sound of soft crying from somewhere upstairs, so faint it might have been the wind, but somehow too heartbroken to be anything but human. Grace's second morning in the mansion began with the sound of harsh words echoing from the breakfast room, Isabella's voice cutting through the morning air like shattered glass. She found 8-year-old Daniel standing frozen beside his chair, tears streaming down his face, while Isabella towered over him with disappointment radiating from every line of her perfectly composed features. "Your Korean pronunciation is absolutely terrible, Daniel," Isabella said with the kind of controlled fury that felt more dangerous than screaming. "How do you expect to represent this family when you sound like a common street child?" The boy's shoulders shook with silent sobs as Isabella continued her verbal assault, criticizing everything from his posture to his breathing while he struggled to repeat Korean phrases that seemed to tangle in his throat like broken wire. Grace watched from the doorway as Daniel's small hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his whole body radiating the kind of helplessness that made her maternal instincts roar to life. When Isabella finally dismissed him with a wave of disgust, Grace followed the child to the garden, where he collapsed on a stone bench and wept with the abandon of someone who believed they were completely alone in the world. Sitting beside him on the bench, Grace spoke in the gentlest voice she possessed, telling him that learning a language was like learning to ride a bicycle and that falling down was just part of the process until your balance improved. She shared stories about Marcus struggling with math homework and Keisha trying to pronounce big words, painting pictures of normal childhood struggles that seemed to surprise Daniel with their ordinariness. When she asked if he would like to practice English with her instead, his eyes lit up with something that looked almost like hope, and he nodded so eagerly that Grace felt her heart break a little for how starved he was for simple kindness. That evening after Woojin left for another late business meeting, Grace discovered both children sitting in the hallway outside their bedrooms, looking lost and forgotten in a house that should have been their sanctuary. Isabella had retired to her suite with strict instructions that the children were not to disturb her beauty routine, leaving Daniel and Sophia to navigate bedtime alone in a way that seemed both routine and heartbreaking. Grace made a decision that would change everything, inviting them to her room for what she called story time, watching their faces transform with wonder as she described magical places where brave children overcame impossible odds through courage and friendship. 6-year-old Sophia curled against Grace's side like a kitten seeking warmth. Her small voice whispered that she missed her mommy's stories and that Isabella never read to them because it was the nanny's job, but they didn't have a nanny anymore. Daniel sat cross-legged on the floor, hanging on every word of Grace's tales about princesses who saved kingdoms and boys who befriended dragons, his silence speaking volumes about hunger for connection that had gone unfed for far too long. When Grace finished her first story, both children begged for another, and she realized that these bedtime moments might become the most important part of her job, even though they weren't written in any contract. The next few days revealed the twisted theater of Isabella's double life, her performance of devoted stepmother dissolving the moment Woojin disappeared from sight. Grace watched with growing horror as Isabella's mask slipped to reveal something cold and calculating underneath. A woman who saw the children as obstacles to her perfect life, rather than human beings deserving of love and protection. During breakfast, Isabella would praise Daniel's improving appetite while secretly pinching his arm under the table, or compliment Sophia's dress while yanking her hair when adjusting the bow, each cruelty disguised as caring attention. The children learned to read Isabella's moods like meteorologists tracking dangerous storms, their small bodies tensing whenever she entered a room because they never knew which version of her they would encounter. Grace noticed how they held their breath during Isabella's fake sweet moments, waiting for the inevitable shift when her smile would turn predatory and her voice would drop to that dangerous whisper that promised consequences for the smallest infractions. The house felt like a beautiful prison where two innocent souls walked on eggshells, while their father remained oblivious to the psychological warfare happening under his own roof. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the children's rooms, Grace discovered something that explained Daniel's profound sadness and confirmed her worst fears about the household dynamics. Sophia appeared in the doorway and approached with the careful steps of someone checking for landmines, her voice barely above a whisper as she confided that Daniel had not spoken a single word since their mother died 2 years ago. The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow, realizing that the boy's silence was not shyness but trauma, and that Isabella's criticism of his Korean pronunciation was particularly cruel since he struggled to speak in any language. Sophia continued in her tiny voice, explaining that Daniel used to sing and laugh and tell jokes before Mommy got sick, but after the funeral, he just stopped talking, and Isabella got angry because she said quiet children were creepy and made the house feel haunted. The little girl's eyes filled with tears as she admitted that she was scared Isabella would send them away to boarding school like she threatened when they made too much noise, and that sometimes she pretended to be asleep when Isabella checked on them, because angry Isabella was scarier than the monsters in her nightmares. Grace pulled Sophia into a gentle hug, feeling the child's small body relax against her warmth while she promised that some grown-ups were meant to protect children and others were still learning how to do it right. She did not want to speak ill of Isabella directly, but she wanted Sophia to understand that the fear she felt was not normal or acceptable, and that brave little girls sometimes needed to tell trusted adults when they felt unsafe. As she held the trembling child, Grace realized with crystal clarity that these children had no one else fighting for them, and that her job description had just expanded far beyond cooking and cleaning to include something much more dangerous and important. That evening's confrontation came when Grace gently suggested that the children might benefit from earlier bedtimes with calming routines, and Isabella's response revealed the depth of her resentment toward anyone who dared question her authority. "You need to remember your place in this household, Grace," Isabella said with ice in her voice and steel in her spine. "These children are not your concern, and your job is to clean and cook, not to play therapist or surrogate mother to children who already have everything they need." Grace felt the warning like a physical slap, understanding that Isabella viewed her growing relationship with Daniel and Sophia as a direct threat to whatever twisted control she exercised over the family dynamics. The conversation ended with Isabella's smile returning, sharp and dangerous, as she reminded Grace that immigration status could be fragile things and that families back home depended on employment remaining stable and uninterrupted. The threat hung in the air like smoke, choking off Grace's response while Isabella glided away, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and barely contained menace. As Grace prepared for bed that night, she video-called Marcus and Keisha with a heavy heart, listening to their excited chatter about school and friends while wrestling with the growing realization that protecting Daniel and Sophia might put her own children's future at risk. The choice felt impossible, but as she heard soft crying from upstairs again, Grace knew that she could not stand by and watch two innocent souls suffer when she had the power to offer them comfort and protection, even if it meant walking a tightrope between her duty to her own family and her conscience. The sound of Sophia's terrified screaming pierced through the mansion's marble walls like a siren, sending Grace racing up the main staircase toward a sound that triggered every protective instinct in her body. She found Isabella dragging the 6-year-old toward a storage closet under the grand staircase, the little girl's feet barely touching the ground as she sobbed and pleaded for forgiveness in a voice raw with terror. "I miss my mommy," Sophia had whispered during lunch, and apparently that simple expression of grief had triggered Isabella's rage like gasoline thrown on a fire. "You want to cry about your dead mother," Isabella hissed through gritted teeth as she shoved Sophia into the dark closet space barely large enough for a child to stand. "Then you can sit in the dark and think about how ungrateful you are for everything I do for you and your brother." The closet door slammed shut with finality, followed by the sound of a key turning in the lock, while Sophia's muffled sobs echoed from behind the wooden barrier like the cries of a caged animal. Grace stood frozen in the hallway, her mind reeling between disbelief and fury as Isabella smoothed her hair and adjusted her clothes as if nothing had happened. When their eyes met, Isabella's expression transformed into something almost pleasant, her voice taking on that sickeningly sweet tone she used around Wu Jin as she explained that children needed to learn that dwelling on sadness was unhealthy and that sometimes firm discipline helped them appreciate their blessings. The casual cruelty in her words made Grace's stomach turn, but she forced herself to remain calm while mentally calculating how long a small child could survive in that airless space. 2 hours passed before Isabella finally unlocked the closet door, revealing Sophia curled into a trembling ball with tear stains on her cheeks and terror in her eyes that seemed far too old for her innocent face. The little girl stumbled out on unsteady legs, immediately seeking Grace's arms with desperate fingers that clung like someone drowning. Isabella watched this reunion with cold satisfaction, reminding Grace that emotional children often needed time to reflect on their behavior, and that consistency was key to proper child rearing in Korean households. That evening, while helping Daniel with his bath, Grace discovered finger-shaped bruises blooming purple and yellow along his thin arms, evidence of Isabella's increasingly physical discipline methods. The boy's eyes pleaded with her to ignore the marks while his silence screamed louder than any words could, both of them understanding that acknowledging the abuse might make it worse. Grace gently cleaned around the bruises while fighting back tears of rage, knowing that each mark represented a moment when this innocent child had been hurt by someone who was supposed to protect him. The confrontation happened 3 days later when Grace could no longer pretend she had not seen what was happening right in front of her eyes. She approached Isabella in the kitchen with carefully chosen words, suggesting that the children seemed stressed and might benefit from gentler guidance techniques. Isabella's reaction was swift and brutal, her mask dropping completely as she stepped close enough for Grace to smell her expensive perfume mixed with the sharp scent of barely controlled violence. "You seem to have forgotten that you are domestic help, not a child psychologist," Isabella said with her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that made the air feel thick with threat. "These children were wild and undisciplined when I came into their lives, and my methods are producing results that their father appreciates. If you continue to question my parenting, I will have no choice but to inform immigration services that you have been overstepping your visa boundaries by interfering in family matters rather than performing your assigned duties." The threat hit Grace like a physical blow because both women understood exactly what Isabella was promising. A phone call to the authorities would result in deportation, leaving Marcus and Keisha without the financial support that kept them fed and housed while destroying Grace's only chance to build a better future for her family. Isabella's smile grew wider as she watched this realization sink in, her satisfaction evident as she reminded Grace that Korean families valued loyalty and obedience in their household staff. Over the following weeks, Isabella began systematically isolating the children from Grace, changing schedules and routines to minimize their contact while increasing her surveillance of every interaction. Daniel and Sophia were suddenly required to attend extra tutoring sessions during the hours when Grace had previously helped with homework, and their bedtime was moved earlier to prevent the story sessions that had become their only source of comfort. The children's confused looks when these changes were announced broke Grace's heart, but she could only watch helplessly as Isabella tightened her control like a noose. Grace began documenting everything in a small notebook hidden in her room, recording dates and descriptions of Isabella's behavior, while taking photos of bruises and marks whenever possible. But even as she gathered evidence, the weight of her vulnerable position pressed down like a stone in her chest. As an immigrant worker with limited legal knowledge and no connections in Korean society, she had no idea who would believe her word against Isabella's wealth and influence. The fear of deportation haunted her dreams, mixing with images of Marcus and Keisha losing their home because their mother had been too righteous for her own good. Kong Woo-jin remained completely oblivious to the war being waged in his own house, his attention consumed by business dealings that kept him away for increasingly long hours. When he was home, Isabella performed her devoted stepmother role with Academy Award precision, praising the children's improvement and crediting her firm but loving guidance for their better behavior. Woo Jin accepted this performance without question, grateful that his fiancée had brought stability to his household after the chaos of his wife's death and his own grief-induced neglect. The breaking point came when Grace discovered Sophia hiding in the pantry during what should have been her afternoon playtime. The little girl's body shaking with silent sobs as she pressed herself into the furthest corner like a small animal seeking shelter from a predator. When Grace knelt beside her and whispered gentle questions, Sophia finally revealed that Isabella had told her that children who cried too much got sent to orphanages where no one would ever love them again, and that if she ever mentioned missing her mother to her father, both she and Daniel would be taken away forever. The manipulation was so cruel and calculated that Grace had to step outside to prevent herself from marching upstairs and confronting Isabella with all the fury building in her chest, like a volcano preparing to erupt. She realized with crystal clarity that Isabella was not just abusing these children physically, but systematically destroying their sense of safety and belonging in their own home. The psychological warfare was designed to make them complicit in their own suffering, too terrified to seek help from the one person who might actually protect them. That night, as Grace video called her own children, listening to Marcus reading from his favorite book and Keisha describing her art project, the contrast between their safe happiness and Daniel and Sophia's fearful existence felt like a knife twisting in her soul. She was trapped between her duty to her own family and her conscience, knowing that every day she remained silent was another day these innocent children suffered while she prioritized her own survival over their immediate safety. Isabella seemed to sense Grace's growing desperation and began pushing boundaries with increasing boldness, her cruelty becoming more frequent and creative, as if she was testing how much she could get away with before Grace finally broke. The punishments escalated from isolation to physical pain to psychological torture, each incident designed to demonstrate her absolute power over everyone in the household, while reminding Grace that speaking up would cost everything she had sacrificed to achieve. As Grace lay awake listening to the sounds of crying from upstairs, she realized that Isabella's campaign of terror was building towards something even worse, and that her silence was enabling escalation that might soon cross lines from which there would be no return. The choice between her own family's security and these children's lives was tearing her apart. But deep in her heart, she knew that some things were worth risking everything to prevent, and that courage sometimes meant accepting consequences that felt too terrible to survive. The sound that shattered Grace's world came at 3 in the afternoon, when Isabella's scream of pure rage echoed through the mansion like breaking glass, followed immediately by the crash of something expensive hitting the marble floor. Grace dropped the laundry she was folding and ran toward the sound, her heart already pounding with the certainty that something terrible was about to happen. She found Isabella standing in the living room holding Daniel's tablet, her face contorted with fury while both children cowered against the wall like small animals trapped by a predator. "You called your father," Isabella hissed through clenched teeth, her voice shaking with barely controlled violence as she waved the device in the air. "You tried to tell him lies about me, you ungrateful little monsters." Daniel's eyes were wide with terror, while Sophia pressed herself against her brother, both of them understanding that they had crossed a line from which there would be no mercy. The tablet had recorded their attempted video call to Wu Jin, their small voices whispering about bruises and closets and being scared, evidence of rebellion that Isabella would never forgive. Grace watched in horror as Isabella grabbed both children by their arms, dragging them toward the basement stairs while they stumbled and cried in voices that seemed to tear something fundamental in the universe. "You want to play victim?" Isabella snarled as she hauled them down the steps. "Then let me show you what real victims experience." The basement was a maze of storage rooms and mechanical equipment, but Isabella moved with purpose toward a door Grace had never noticed, revealing an industrial freezer unit that hummed with mechanical coldness. The freezer was massive, designed for commercial food storage, but emptied for the family's upcoming renovation project, its walls lined with metal shelving that gleamed like prison bars under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Isabella shoved Daniel inside first, his small body disappearing into the frigid darkness while his mouth opened in a silent scream that contained all the words he had not spoken for 2 years. Sophia fought like a wildcat when her turn came, her tiny fists beating against Isabella's arms while she begged for mercy in a voice that broke Grace's heart into pieces small enough to scatter on the wind. "Please, Aunt Isabella, please, we're sorry. We won't tell anyone anything. We promise. We'll be good. Sophia sobbed as Isabella lifted her into the freezer beside her brother. The children's desperate pleas echoed off the metal walls while Isabella's face showed nothing but cold satisfaction, her anger transforming into something clinical and terrifying as she prepared to seal them inside their frozen tomb. You can think about loyalty while you freeze, she said with deadly calm. Maybe the cold will teach you lessons that words could not. Grace stood paralyzed at the bottom of the stairs, her mind struggling to process the reality of what she was witnessing while her body remained frozen by shock and terror. The sound of the heavy freezer door slamming shut broke her paralysis like a gunshot, followed immediately by the mechanical click of the industrial lock engaging. Isabella turned the key with deliberate precision, her movements controlled and purposeful, as if she had planned this moment for weeks rather than acting in sudden rage. The children's muffled screams penetrated the thick insulation, their voices growing more desperate and frightened as the reality of their situation crashed over them like ice water. Grace found her voice and her courage in the same instant, rushing toward the freezer while shouting Isabella's name with all the authority she could muster. "This is insane," Grace yelled as she grabbed for the door handle. "They're just children. They'll freeze to death in there. You have to let them out right now before someone gets seriously hurt." Isabella's response came in the form of a pistol pulled from her purse, the silver weapon catching the fluorescent light as she pointed it directly at Grace's chest with steady hands that revealed this was not her first time threatening someone with deadly force. "You need to leave this house immediately," Isabella said in a voice devoid of emotion or humanity. "Pack your things and get out, or I will call immigration and have you deported tonight after I explain how you attacked me and threatened my family." Grace stared down the barrel of the gun while the children's cries grew weaker behind the freezer door, their voices taking on the desperate quality of living things slowly dying. Time stretched like taffy while Grace calculated temperatures and survival rates, knowing that young bodies lost heat faster than adults, and that hypothermia could kill within hours in sub-zero conditions. The choice crystallized with perfect clarity: her safety versus their lives, her future versus their present, her fear versus her conscience. Without conscious thought or consideration for consequences, Grace lunged toward the freezer door despite the weapon trained on her chest. Isabella's surprised shout mixed with the sound of Grace's shoulder hitting the metal barrier, her hands frantically working the lock mechanism while the gun remained pointed at her back. The key turned just as Isabella's finger found the trigger, the mechanical click of the opening lock coinciding with Grace's prayer that she would live long enough to pull those babies out of their frozen prison. The door swung open to reveal Daniel and Sophia huddled together in the furthest corner, their lips already tinged blue while their small bodies shook with violent shivers that spoke of advancing hypothermia. Grace dove into the freezer to gather them in her arms, feeling their skin cold as marble while their breathing came in shallow gasps that misted in the frigid air. Behind her, Isabella's rage reached a crescendo of violence and profanity, her threats becoming more creative and deadly as Grace carried the children towards safety. The physical confrontation erupted when Isabella tried to prevent Grace from reaching the stairs, her manicured nails raking across Grace's face while she screamed about ungrateful servants and ruined plans. Grace fought with the desperate strength of a mother protecting her young, using her body as a shield while carrying two freezing children who clung to her with fingers too cold to grip properly. Isabella's gun had fallen during the struggle, skittering across the basement floor while both women battled for control of the situation and the children's fate. Grace reached the main floor with both children in her arms, their bodies warming slightly, but still showing signs of dangerous exposure to cold. Daniel's silence had been replaced by chattering teeth while Sophia whispered "Mama" over and over, the words slipping out in her confusion between Grace and the mother she had lost years ago. Grace's hands shook as she dialed emergency services, her voice breaking as she reported child endangerment and attempted murder, while Isabella's threats echoed from the basement below. The sirens arrived within minutes that felt like hours, paramedics rushing past Isabella's attempts to explain the situation as a misunderstanding between domestic staff and family authority. Grace watched the emergency workers wrap Daniel and Sophia in thermal blankets while checking their vital signs, the children's eyes never leaving her face, as if she were the only anchor keeping them tethered to safety in a world that had proven capable of unthinkable cruelty. Police officers separated Grace and Isabella into different rooms for questioning, but not before Grace watched them place handcuffs on the woman who had nearly murdered two innocent children in service of her twisted need for control. As the ambulance pulled away with Daniel and Sophia heading toward medical treatment, Grace realized that her choice to act had changed everything irreversibly, and that some lines could never be uncrossed once courage demanded they be stepped over in service of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The Seoul National University Hospital became Grace's second home during the 72 hours when Daniel and Sophia fought their way back from the edge of hypothermia-induced death, their small bodies hooked to machines that monitored every heartbeat, while Grace maintained a vigil that never wavered. The doctors spoke in careful medical terms about core body temperatures and potential organ damage, but Grace heard only the sound of their breathing and the blessed warmth returning to fingers that had been blue as winter sky when she pulled them from that mechanical tomb. Daniel opened his eyes first on the second day, his gaze immediately seeking Grace's face with desperate intensity before his mouth formed the first word he had spoken in 2 years. "Mama," he whispered in a voice rusty from disuse and damaged vocal cords, the syllable carrying more meaning than entire conversations as tears rolled down his cheeks. Grace took his small hand in both of hers, feeling the miracle of warmth and life pulsing beneath skin that had been cold as marble just hours before, while she promised him over and over that he was safe and that no one would ever hurt him again. Sophia woke on the third day with memories fragmented by trauma and cold, but her first coherent words were questions about whether Isabella was still in the house and whether she and Daniel would have to go back to the basement. Grace sat beside her hospital bed and explained in gentle terms that Isabella had been taken away by police officers and that there were laws to protect children from people who hurt them, watching relief wash over the little girl's face like sunrise after the longest night in history. The children's recovery became a daily series of small victories. Each returned smile and whispered thank you, rebuilding their shattered sense of safety one moment at a time. The police investigation unfolded with methodical precision as Detective Park assembled evidence that painted a picture of systematic child abuse hidden behind wealth and social standing. Grace's documentation proved invaluable, her careful notes and photographs corroborating the children's hospital testimony and building an unshakable case against Isabella. The detective explained that Grace's courage in breaking down that freezer door had not only saved 2 lives, but also provided the evidence needed to ensure justice, transforming her from frightened domestic worker to key witness in a criminal case that would set important precedents. Kong Woo-jin's arrival at the hospital on the 4th day brought a confrontation that Grace had dreaded since the moment she called emergency services. He entered the children's room like a broken man, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face showing the kind of exhaustion that comes from having your entire world shattered in a single phone call. When he saw Daniel and Sophia wrapped in blankets with forlines in their small arms, his composure crumbled completely, and he collapsed into the chair beside their beds with sobs that seemed to tear his soul apart. "I failed them," Woo-jin whispered to Grace through his tears, his voice carrying the weight of guilt that would probably haunt him for the rest of his life. "I trusted her with the most precious things in my world, and she nearly killed them while I was obsessing over business deals that don't matter. How do I live with knowing that my children almost died because I was too blind to see what was happening in my own house?" Grace watched this powerful man transform into a devastated father, understanding that his grief was genuine and that Isabella had manipulated him as skillfully as she had terrorized the children. The weeks leading up to Isabella's trial became a period of healing and legal preparation, with Grace making the most difficult decision of her life when she agreed to testify despite the risks to her immigration status. Her lawyer, provided by a domestic workers' rights organization, explained that her testimony could result in deportation if Isabella's legal team painted her as an unstable foreign worker interfering in family matters. But Grace looked at Daniel and Sophia's recovering faces and knew that some fights were worth every possible consequence, that justice for them mattered more than her own safety. The courtroom on the day of her testimony filled with supporters that Grace had never expected, domestic workers from across Seoul who had heard about her case and came to show solidarity with someone who had risked everything to protect children. Their presence gave Grace strength as she walked to the witness stand, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. She spoke directly to the judge and jury about what she had witnessed, her words painting a picture of psychological and physical abuse that made several jurors visibly emotional. When Isabella's defense attorney tried to portray Grace as an unstable immigrant who had misunderstood cultural differences in child discipline, Grace's response silenced the courtroom with its quiet dignity and unshakable moral clarity. There is no culture on earth that considers locking children in freezers acceptable discipline, Grace said with her voice carrying across the silent room. What I witnessed was not cultural misunderstanding, but criminal cruelty, and I would make the same choice to save those children again, even knowing all the consequences I might face. Her testimony inspired 3 other domestic workers to come forward with their own stories of abuse by wealthy employers, creating a domino effect that expanded the case beyond Isabella's individual crimes to expose systemic exploitation of vulnerable workers. Grace watched from the gallery as these brave women shared their experiences, realizing that her decision to speak up had given others the courage to break their own silence and demand justice for themselves and the children in their care. The verdict came on a rainy Tuesday that felt like the world was crying tears of relief when the judge sentenced Isabella to 8 years in prison for child endangerment, assault, and attempted murder. The courtroom erupted in applause that felt like justice finally finding its voice, while Grace held Daniel and Sophia's hands and whispered that the bad lady could never hurt them again. Isabella's shocked face as the sentence was read showed that she had never imagined facing real consequences for actions she considered within her rights as a stepmother disciplining difficult children. Kong Woo-jin approached Grace after the sentencing with humility that transformed their relationship from employer and employee to something approaching family. He thanked her with words that seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what she had done, but his actions spoke louder when he promised to help bring her own children to Seoul and to support her immigration status through every legal channel available. The man who had been oblivious to his children's suffering became their fierce protector, dedicating himself to rebuilding their sense of security while honoring the woman who had saved their lives. The media coverage of the trial sparked national conversations about domestic worker rights and child protection, with Grace's story becoming a symbol of moral courage that inspired legislative changes and increased oversight of household employment. She found herself invited to speak at conferences and support groups, her voice carrying far beyond that courtroom to reach other women who needed to know that speaking truth to power was possible even when the stakes felt impossibly high. As Grace stood outside the courthouse with Daniel and Sophia clinging to her hands, she realized that her choice to act had changed all their lives in ways she could never have imagined. The children looked up at her with trust rebuilt from the ashes of trauma, while she understood that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for personal gain, but for the simple principle that innocent people deserve protection regardless of the cost to their protectors. The rain stopped as they walked toward their car, and Grace saw rainbow fragments in the puddles reflecting light that seemed to promise better days ahead for all of them. Justice had been served, truth had been spoken, and love had proven stronger than fear in ways that would echo far beyond this single story of courage triumphing over cruelty. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that included healing, family, and the knowledge that even the most powerless people could change the world when they chose to act with unshakable moral conviction. The morning Grace's children stepped off the plane at Incheon Airport marked the beginning of a new chapter written in languages of love that transcended every barrier that had once seemed impossible to cross. Marcus and Keisha emerged from the gate holding hands and scanning the crowd with eyes wide with wonder at finding themselves in a country that existed only in their mother's stories, until they spotted Grace running toward them with tears streaming down her face and arms spread wide enough to gather them both into a reunion that felt like breathing again after months of holding her breath. Daniel and Sophia waited beside Woo-jin in the airport pickup area, their nervous excitement evident in the way they fidgeted with the welcome signs they had painted for their new siblings. The moment when all four children met became a collision of shy smiles and careful curiosity. Marcus and Keisha studying these Korean children their mother had described in video calls, while Daniel and Sophia wondered if these American visitors would understand the bond they shared with the woman who had saved their lives. Grace watched this tentative introduction with her heart expanding like a balloon filling with hope, knowing that family was not always about blood, but sometimes about the connections forged through shared protection and mutual care. The mansion that had once felt like a beautiful prison transformed into a sanctuary, filled with the sounds of children's laughter echoing through rooms that remembered only silence and fear. Woo Jin had redecorated the children's wing with input from all four kids, creating spaces that reflected their individual personalities while fostering the unity that was slowly growing between them. Marcus proved to be the natural comedian who could make Daniel laugh until he forgot to be careful with his words, while Keisha's artistic talents inspired Sophia to express her feelings through drawings that showed their family growing larger and brighter with each passing day. The breakthrough moment came 3 weeks after the reunion, when Daniel approached Grace in the kitchen and spoke the word that would change everything between them forever. "Iyama," he said in careful Korean, his voice stronger than it had been since his mother's death, but filled with emotion that made the syllables tremble. The Korean word for mother fell from his lips like a gift he was offering to the woman who had risked everything to protect him, and Grace's response was to kneel down and gather him into a hug that promised acceptance of the role he was asking her to fill. Sophia's adoption of Grace as her second mother happened more gradually, but with equal sincerity, starting with small requests for bedtime stories and growing into the kind of trust that allowed her to share her deepest fears and hopes. When she began calling Grace Mama in English while teaching Keisha and Marcus Korean phrases, the blending of languages became a metaphor for the blending of their hearts into something stronger than any individual loss or pain. The children created their own fusion vocabulary that mixed Korean endearments with Southern expressions, building a family dialect that belonged uniquely to their chosen bonds. The legal process of formalizing their unconventional family structure required navigating complex immigration and adoption procedures that tested everyone's patience and commitment. Woo Jin hired the best family lawyers in Seoul to ensure that Grace's children could remain in Korea permanently, while also securing Grace's own legal status as something more permanent than a domestic worker. The paperwork took months to complete, but each approved document felt like another foundation stone being laid for a future that had seemed impossible during those dark days when Isabella controlled their lives. The idea for the Grace Williams Foundation emerged from conversations with other domestic workers who approached Grace after the trial, sharing their own stories of exploitation and abuse while seeking guidance on how to protect themselves and the children in their care. Grace realized that her experience had given her a platform to create systemic change rather than just individual justice, and she began working with legal advocates to establish an organization dedicated to protecting vulnerable workers and the families they served. The foundation's first office opened 6 months after Isabella's conviction, occupying a renovated building in Seoul's immigrant district that became a beacon of hope for workers who had previously suffered in silence. Grace's days became filled with training sessions on legal rights, support groups for trauma survivors, and advocacy meetings with government officials who were finally listening to voices that had been ignored for too long. The work was demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but every worker who found courage to speak up validated Grace's decision to transform her personal nightmare into a force for protecting others. Woo Jin's support for the foundation went far beyond financial contributions as he used his business connections and social influence to pressure other wealthy families to treat their domestic staff with dignity and respect. His transformation from oblivious employer to passionate advocate demonstrated that even people raised in privilege could learn to see the humanity in those who served them. The foundation's board meetings in the mansion's former dining room symbolized how spaces once associated with hierarchy and control had been transformed into centers of equality and empowerment. 1 year after the trial, Grace stood in the foundation's conference room addressing a crowd of domestic workers, their families, and the journalists covering their latest legislative victory. The new laws requiring contracts, minimum wages, and oversight for household employees represented a fundamental shift in how Korean society viewed domestic work, changing the lives of thousands of women who had previously existed in legal limbo. Grace's speech that day focused not on her own courage, but on the collective strength that emerged when people chose to support each other rather than suffer alone. The celebration continued that evening at the mansion where all 5 children now lived as legal siblings under adoption papers that made their chosen family official in the eyes of the law. Marcus had grown 3 inches and learned to say sarangi with perfect pronunciation, while Keisha's Korean had improved enough for her to translate jokes between Daniel and Sophia that left all the adults laughing even when they missed the punchlines. Daniel's vocabulary had exploded as his confidence grew, and Sophia had begun writing stories about brave children who protected each other from monsters both real and imaginary. As Grace tucked each child into bed that night, moving between rooms that buzzed with whispered conversations and giggled secrets, she marveled at how dramatically their world had changed since that first terrifying night when she heard crying through the mansion walls. These children had become her children not through birth, but through the bonds forged when courage demanded action and love required sacrifice. Their bedtime prayers now included gratitude for found family and protection for all the children whose voices had not yet been heard. The final scene of their transformation played out on the mansion's garden terrace, where Grace and Woo Jin watched their 5 children playing a game that seemed to involve equal parts Korean traditional songs and American playground rules. The sound of their laughter carried across the Seoul skyline like a promise that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds, and that families could be built from the most unlikely combinations of circumstances and choices. Grace thought about all the viewers who might be watching their story and wondering about their own capacity for courage in impossible situations. I hope some of you watching this will share in the comments about times when you found strength you didn't know you had. Because sometimes knowing that others have faced their fears and chosen to act can give us the courage we need to stand up for what's right in our own lives, even when the cost seems too high to pay. The sun set behind the Seoul mountains while their children played, and Grace realized that the sacrifice that had brought her to Korea had transformed into something she could never have imagined when she kissed Marcus and Keisha goodbye at that Atlanta airport. She had come to Seoul to save her original family, and ended up creating an entirely new one while building a foundation that would protect countless others from the kind of suffering Daniel and Sophia had endured. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that included not just survival, but transformation, not just healing, but justice, and the knowledge that even the smallest acts of courage could change the world in ways that rippled far beyond the original moment of choice. The children called for Grace to join their game, and she walked toward their voices knowing that every step she had taken since that night in the basement had led to this moment when chosen family gathered in safety, while their foundation worked to protect others who still waited for someone brave enough to break down the doors that kept them trapped. Love had conquered fear, justice had emerged from suffering, and their story continued not as an ending, but as a beginning for all the families yet to be saved by courage that refused to remain silent in the face of cruelty.